The door of Daniel Bancroft's mountain cabin swung open before he could reach for the latch, and the woman standing on the other side of it looked like she had walked through the gates of hell and come out with her chin still raised. She was soaking wet from the freezing rain that had been hammering the Colorado Rockies since nightfall, her dark hair plastered to her neck, her riding coat torn at the left shoulder, and her eyes deep violet gray, sharp as a hawk's, fixed on him with an intensity that stopped him cold in the doorway of his own home. She was not begging. She was not trembling. She was calculating, reading him the way a trapper reads a trail, deciding in the span of a single breath whether he was a threat or a resource. "Your back pasture gate is unlatched," she said, her voice steady despite the cold. "Your roan gelding is going to be in the tree line by morning if you don't secure it." Daniel Bancroft stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and had lived alone in these mountains for 4 years. He had survived a Wyoming winter with a broken leg and 1-horse blanket. He had faced down a grizzly with nothing but a skinning knife. He had tracked men through blizzards and found them, and he had also once done the opposite, helped a man disappear so completely that the law never found the trail. He had never in his life been walked up to by a stranger at his cabin door at 9 in the evening in the middle of a mountain rainstorm and been corrected about his own livestock before she had so much as told him her name. "Who are you?" he asked. "Violet Talmadge," she said. "I need shelter for one night. I will pay, work, or barter, your choice, but you should see to that horse first." He stared at her for one more second, then turned and went to see about the horse. She was right. The roan was 10 feet from the tree line, testing the darkness with his nose. Daniel caught him by the halter, walked him back to the paddock, and latched the gate with the secondary iron pin he usually forgot about. When he returned to the porch, she was still standing exactly where he had left her, not having moved inside uninvited, not having bolted, just standing in the rain with her arms at her sides like patience was a thing she had made her peace with a long time ago. He held the door open. She walked inside. That was how it started. But the real story had started 2 days earlier, on a trail through the high timber above Creede, Colorado, in the autumn of 1882, when Daniel Bancroft found a boot print in the mud beside Copper Creek and felt the first, strange, electric current of something he could not yet name run straight up the back of his neck. The boot print was small, a woman's boot, narrow-toed, with a distinctive heel pattern that he had never seen before in 4 years of reading this particular stretch of mountain trail. The print was fresh, maybe 6 hours old, the edges still crisp where the mud had begun to dry at the rim, and it was heading north, toward the higher elevations, toward the places where the trails thinned to game paths and the game paths eventually thinned to nothing but rock and sky. Daniel Bancroft had not survived 4 years of mountain isolation by ignoring things that did not fit the pattern. He crouched over that print for a long time, reading it the way he read everything in the wilderness, completely, without hurry, with total respect for what the evidence was actually telling him rather than what he assumed it would say. The stride was confident. Long for a woman's step, purposeful, not the shortened step of someone picking their way carefully through unfamiliar terrain. She knew where she was going, or she thought she did. The right foot was carrying slightly more weight, which meant the left leg might be favoring something minor, a sore ankle, a bruise, nothing serious enough to stop her. The heel of the left boot had a peculiar double mark, like the outer edge of the heel plate was slightly raised from the leather, a manufacturing quirk or a repair done in the field. He filed that detail away without knowing why. He looked up the trail toward the higher peaks. The sky was beginning to build the kind of clouds that promised rain within 48 hours. Whoever she was heading into bad weather, into isolated country, alone. He checked the trail more carefully and found no second set of prints, no horse tracks, no boot prints beside hers that would indicate a companion. She was genuinely alone. He followed her trail for 50 yards, not because he had decided to follow her, but because he was curious about her route choices, and what he found surprised him. She had not taken the obvious path, the one that climbed the ridge and then followed the ridgeline north. That was the route any reasonable person would choose: visible, clear, relatively direct. Instead, she had gone left at the fork, taking the lower drainage route through the dense spruce, which was harder going underfoot, but which cut an entire half-day off the journey to the high basin country if you knew exactly which game trails connected, and where the creek was shallow enough to cross. He stood at that fork for a long moment. She knew this country, or she had studied it very carefully before arriving. He turned back toward his own business. He had a trap line to check, a supply run to complete before the weather closed in, and no particular reason to go chasing after a competent stranger who had not asked for his help. But he thought about those boot prints for the rest of the day, which was not like him. And he thought about them again that night, sitting by his fire with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and the wind beginning to build outside the cabin walls, and he could not entirely explain why he kept returning to the image of those small, purposeful tracks heading alone into the high country, as the sky turned the color of a bruise. He had been alone for a long time. He told himself that was all it was. Violet Talmadge had arrived in Creede, Colorado, 3 days before Daniel found her print on his trail, and she had arrived with a purpose that was entirely her own, which was how she preferred all of her purposes. She was 28 years old, the daughter of a Colorado surveyor who had died of a heart attack on a mountainside when she was 14, and she had spent the 14 years since that day learning everything he had ever tried to teach her, and then going considerably further than he had ever gone. She was a surveyor, not a woman who had watched a surveyor, not a woman who had assisted a surveyor. A surveyor, full-trained, with instruments she had acquired through 3 years of correspondence with a firm in Denver, a skill set that had taken her a decade to master working in secret, because no firm in the territory would hire a woman in an official capacity, regardless of what she could do with a theodolite and a Gunter's chain. But the General Land Office survey of the high basin country above Creede was behind schedule due to the death of the contracted surveyor, a man named Harrison Webb who had suffered a fall in September, and the subcontracting firm that had taken over the work was desperate enough or forward-thinking enough, depending on who you asked, to accept the bid of one Violet Talmadge, independent surveyor, who had submitted the most detailed preliminary survey sketch of that particular terrain that any of them had ever seen, and who had quoted a price 30% below the next lowest bid. She had been working the lower basin for 2 days already when the weather changed. She had 6 days of survey data in her field notebook, triangulation points established, elevation marks driven, and a draft of the section lines that was going to resolve a land dispute that had been sending ranchers to their lawyers for the better part of 3 years. She was good at this. She was, in fact, exceptional at this, and she knew it, and she had long since decided that knowing your own value without apology was not arrogance but simple accuracy. What she had not anticipated was Mercer Vane. Mercer Vane was a land speculator out of Pueblo who had been watching the survey situation above Creede with considerable interest, because the survey would determine exactly where the eastern boundary of the Hollowell grazing grant fell, and if that boundary fell where Mercer Vane hoped it would fall, which was approximately a quarter-mile west of where honest mathematics put it, then Mercer Vane stood to pick up 7,000 acres of prime grazing land at a filing price. If it fell where the mathematics actually put it, those 7,000 acres would belong to the Hollowell heirs, who had a legitimate claim and a legitimate deed, and no interest whatsoever in selling. Vane had managed Harrison Webb with money. He had expected to manage Webb's replacement with money as well. The replacement had turned out to be Violet Talmadge, who had listened to his offer for exactly as long as it took her to understand what he was asking, and then had told him, in terms so precise and so calm that they were somehow more devastating than anger, that she would complete the survey as contracted and file the results with the General Land Office without alteration, and that if he made another approach, she would include a full account of his offer in the accompanying documentation. Vane had left. But he had not, she suspected, left for good. She had been right to suspect it. She found the first sign that she was being followed on the morning of the second day after Vane's visit. A shadow on a rocky outcrop that moved when she moved. A horse that was always just far enough away to pretend it was not following. She changed her route, used the terrain, put a long ridge between herself and whoever was behind her, and pushed north into the higher country where her next survey benchmarks were anyway, deciding that the best course of action was to move faster and finish the work before Vane could find a lever long enough to shift her. She had been heading for the high basin survey points when the weather turned on her in earnest, and she had been 3 miles from the nearest shelter, which was a prospector's cabin marked on her copy of the earlier survey maps, when the rain started, and she had pushed hard through the last of the daylight to reach it. The cabin had smoke coming from its chimney. She had not expected that. She had stood 50 yards away in the rain for a long moment, studying the place, studying the yard, noting the tools, the split wood, the paddock, the quality of the fence work, and she had made her assessment. Someone lived here, someone competent and careful, someone who maintained their property with the kind of consistent attention that spoke of a person who was not running from anything urgent, and was not, therefore, dangerous in the way that drifters and desperate men were dangerous. She had also, because she was who she was, noticed the paddock gate in the process of swinging open in the wind, and the roan gelding inside who was very interested in the dark space it was creating. So when the door opened and the mountain man looked at her with those dark eyes, careful eyes, assessing eyes, honest eyes, she had told him about his horse first, because it was the most immediately practical thing, and because opening with practical value was a better strategy than opening with need. He had gone to see to the horse without arguing about it. That told her what she needed to know. Inside the cabin, she stood near the fire and let the warmth begin to work through the wet layers of her clothing, and she took in the room with the swift, cataloging attention that was second nature to her. The cabin was clean. The tools on the wall were maintained. There were books, more books than she had expected, a full shelf of them, and not just almanacs and frontier practical guides but actual books, history and natural philosophy, and one volume of poetry that looked genuinely read. The maps pinned to the far wall were detailed, hand-annotated, better than anything the General Land Office had on file for this section of the range. She was revising her assessment upward in real time. Daniel came back inside, shaking the rain from his hat, and stood by the door looking at her in that careful way he had, and she realized he was doing exactly what she had been doing, reading the evidence without rushing to conclusion. "You're a surveyor," he said. It was not a question. Her instruments were in the leather case she had set carefully against the wall, and he had read them. "Yes," she said. "Working the Hollowell Basin section." She looked at him more sharply. "You know the survey." "I know the land," he said. "Coffee?" She accepted the coffee. He built the fire higher and found her a dry blanket without being asked, and without making it ceremonious. Just set it on the chair beside her and turned back to the fire. And there was something in that simple, unsentimental competence that she found unexpectedly comfortable. They talked that first night with the careful honesty of two people who had both been alone long enough to know the value of accurate information. He told her who he was: Daniel Bancroft, formerly of Laramie, Wyoming, mountain man, fur trader in declining seasons, hunter, occasional tracker for the county sheriff when the need arose, 4 years resident in this cabin which he had built himself. He told her this without embellishment and without false modesty, and she appreciated both. She told him who she was and what she was doing and why, including Mercer Vane, and she watched his face while she told him and saw the anger move through his eyes, not at her, not at her situation, but at the injustice of what Vane was attempting, and at the more general injustice underneath it, the years of her work being invisible, the skill being unacknowledged, the door that should have been open being perpetually shut. "How far behind are you?" he asked. "I need 3 more days in the high basin," she said. "If the weather holds." "The weather won't hold," he said. "You've got maybe 1 good day, then another front comes through. After that you'd have a week, possibly more, of hard conditions at elevation." She looked at him steadily. "I've worked in hard conditions." "I don't doubt it," he said, and there was nothing patronizing in it, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement. "But the high basin in a November system is a different kind of hard. Visibility drops to 20 feet. The survey posts you drive in the morning are buried by afternoon." She was quiet for a moment. "Then I work fast." A ghost of something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I can take you in by the fast route," he said. "Save you half a day of travel time. I know a path through the eastern drainage that cuts across the lower ridge and puts you at the basin floor by mid-morning." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because Mercer Vane is a dishonest man who benefits from other people's land being stolen," he said flatly. "And because you know your work and you're going to do it right, and someone should make it easier rather than harder." She studied him for a long, careful moment. In her experience, help offered freely always had something behind it, some hidden motive, some price that would be presented later in a currency you had not agreed to. She had learned that lesson early, and she had not forgotten it. But he met her eyes directly, and there was nothing complicated in his face. Just a man who had read a situation correctly and was offering the honest use of his knowledge. "All right," she said. "Thank you." She slept in his cabin that night on the cot he cleared for her near the fire, and he took the bunk at the far end without ceremony. And in the morning she woke to the smell of coffee and salt pork, and the sound of him already at the table, checking his own maps against what she had described of her previous survey work, not looking over her materials without permission, but working from his own knowledge, preparing. She stood in the doorway between the sleeping area and the main room for a moment before he heard her, watching him at the table in the morning light, his big hands moving carefully over the map, and she felt something shift very slightly in the fixed, orderly architecture of the way she understood her life. She ignored it. She had work to do. They left the cabin at first light, her with her surveying kit and field notebook and the dry provisions she carried, him with his rifle and a pack that contained emergency gear, and enough food for a 3-day stay in the high country if the weather forced it. He moved through the mountain terrain like he was part of it, reading the ground naturally, making adjustments to the route without consultation when the footing changed, and she kept pace with him, not being pulled along but keeping pace, because her own years of mountain survey work had made her genuinely capable at altitude travel. He noticed. She saw him notice. The eastern drainage route he had described was everything he had promised. It cut through a canyon she had not identified on her maps, a narrow slot between 2 rock faces that opened unexpectedly onto a high meadow, and from the meadow the basin was visible below, laid out in the morning light like a survey map made real, every ridge and drainage and flat section visible with startling clarity. Violet stopped at the edge of the meadow and looked at the basin below and felt the pure, specific joy that came over her in those moments when the land arranged itself into perfect legibility. Every line of it readable, every slope measurable, the whole complex 3-dimensional truth of it waiting to be translated into the precise language of numbers and bearings and distances that was her particular gift. "There," she said, and she was not talking to him exactly. She was just releasing the thought. He stood beside her and he was quiet for a moment, looking at what she was looking at. "Beautiful country," he said. "It's perfect for the eastern boundary line," she said. "Look, that rock formation at the base of the North Ridge, that's a natural monument point. If I can confirm the elevation against my control points, I can anchor the entire section boundary from there." He looked at the rock formation. He looked at her. "You can tell that from here." "Approximately," she said. "The instrument readings will confirm it." She was already moving, already beginning the descent toward the basin floor. He followed her, and for the rest of that morning he watched her work, and what he witnessed over those hours changed something permanently in the way he understood what a person could be. He was, by his own honest assessment, a man who was good at most things that mattered in the wilderness: tracking, building, hunting, navigation, reading weather, reading terrain. He had never been a man who underestimated others, particularly women, because his mother had been a woman of formidable intelligence, and her opinion had been the standard against which he measured everyone's competence. He did not think of himself as someone who was surprised by capable women. But he had also never seen anything like what Violet Talmadge did with a surveying instrument in her hands. She set up the theodolite with swift, practiced efficiency on the basin floor, taking the time to level it with a precision that was almost musical to watch. The tiny bubble in the level vial settling to center under the steady, graduated adjustments of her fingertips. She called out numbers to herself in a low voice as she read the instrument, and then she wrote them in her field notebook with the focused intensity of someone for whom the numbers were not abstract but alive, meaningful, connected to the real physical truth of the land around her. Then she turned to the backside, reoriented, called more numbers, wrote more notes. She moved the instrument to a second position, a third, building the triangulation network with a systematic patience that was, he realized, not patience at all but deep skill. The kind of skill that had metabolized all the earlier struggle and difficulty, and was now simply flowing, the way a master horseman seems to be doing nothing with his hands because everything he is doing is exactly right. He helped where she asked, holding the range pole at the target points she indicated, reading back numbers when she asked him to, carrying equipment between stations. He did these things without comment, and she directed him without self-consciousness, and there was a quality to working alongside her that was entirely unlike anything he had experienced in his years of solitary mountain life. It was the quality of being genuinely useful to something that mattered. Around midday she stopped, consulted her field notebook, stared at the northern ridge for a long moment and said, "The eastern boundary of the Hollowell Grant is 14 chains east of where Mercer Vein needs it to be." He knew this before he approached Harrison Webb. He knew exactly what the honest survey would show. Daniel looked at her. "You can prove that." "These numbers prove it," she said, holding up the notebook. "And when they are entered in the General Land Office record, they will prove it permanently." He looked at the North Ridge. He looked at her, standing in the thin autumn sunlight with her instrument and her notebook, and the calm, absolute certainty of someone who had done the work and was in possession of the truth. And he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something that moved in him like the beginning of a spring thaw, slow and deep and unstoppable. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Eat something. The weather is going to change in about 3 hours." She ate and they worked, and the afternoon closed around them with the peculiar golden quality of high mountain light in late autumn, and she collected every measurement she needed from the basin floor and began to talk about the second benchmark position on the North Ridge, and he looked at the sky and said, "Violet." It was the first time he had used her given name. It stopped her mid-sentence. "The clouds are moving faster than I thought," he said. "We can push for the ridge and risk being caught up there when the front comes through, or we can start back now and hold what you have. What's the risk if you don't get the ridge benchmark today?" She looked at her notes. He saw her calculating, not whether to trust his weather assessment, but the cost of the alternative. "I can interpolate from the basin measurements and the control points I established last week," she said slowly. "The interpolation won't be as clean as a direct measurement, but it will hold up to review." "Then we go now," he said. She took one more careful look at the North Ridge. He could see the reluctance in her, the professional's desire to have the perfect data rather than the sufficient data, and he respected it even as he knew they had to move. "Now," he said gently. She packed her instrument with the same swift, practiced care, and shouldered her kit, and they started back by the same eastern drainage route. moving faster on the return trip, and the sky above the western peaks was already beginning to build the heavy architecture of a serious mountain storm by the time they cleared the canyon mouth, and Daniel could see the cabin chimney through the trees below. The rain hit them a quarter-mile from the cabin. Not the gentle beginning rain, but the full, committed mountain rain that was cold enough to threaten turning to sleet at the higher elevations. They ran the last stretch through the trees, and by the time they reached the porch they were soaked through, laughing without quite deciding to laugh, from the sudden absurdity of being drenched 10 minutes from safety. Inside, she shook the water from her coat and he built up the fire from the coals and they stood close to it. And the cabin was warm and the storm was outside, and there was something in the situation that was entirely different from the previous night. A familiarity, a comfort, the ease of a day spent in genuine companionship with a person who had proved to be exactly who they appeared to be. "I need to copy the field notes to the fair copy book," she said, pulling her chair up to the table and opening her kit. "While the numbers are fresh. I'll start supper," he said. He cooked while she worked, and he was aware of her at the table behind him in a way that was not disruptive but was very present: the scratch of her pen, the occasional soft-spoken number, the deep, focused quiet of a person engaged with something they loved. He found himself slowing down his cooking to make it take longer, to have more time in that particular quality of shared silence. They ate venison stew that he had made from the last of the week's hunting, and she asked him about the country, not the survey country, but the country itself, and he told her about it with a fullness he had not given to any subject in a long time, because she asked the right questions, the detailed questions, the questions that showed she was genuinely interested in the land as a living place and not just as a professional subject. He told her about the elk migration through the lower meadows in September, about the way the high basin held snow until July in a heavy year, about the cave system in the eastern ridge that he had partially mapped one winter from sheer curiosity, about the stand of ancient spruce near Copper Creek that he believed was older than any written record of the territory. She told him about her father. She told him carefully, measuring the words, which told him it was not something she spoke about easily. She told him about the summer she was 12 when her father had taken her on a survey expedition into the San Juan Range and taught her to read the theodolite, and how she had stood on a high ridge and looked through the instrument and felt, for the first time, the extraordinary power of being able to measure something that appeared unmeasurable, to reduce the grand and towering wilderness to numbers that were absolutely true. "He died 2 years after that," she said. "On a survey in the Sangre de Cristos, his heart gave out on the ascent." She was quiet for a moment. "I kept working. I kept learning. I had nowhere else to put what he had taught me." Daniel was very still. He understood that. He understood it from his own life, from his own private accounting of why he had come to these mountains and stayed in them. The answer to that question was also, at its root, about somewhere to put something, some grief or drive or need that the ordinary arrangements of ordinary life had not been able to contain. "You're very good," he said. "What you did today, the triangulation network, the way you built it in sections, anchoring each new point against the established control, that was advanced technique. I've seen surveyors work, not at that level." She looked at him across the table, and in the firelight her eyes were the color of the sky just before full dark, that particular deep violet gray that was her name made real, and she said, "Most people don't notice the technique. Most people don't know what to look for," he said. The storm hammered the cabin for the rest of the night and into the following morning. They were held in, and it was not unpleasant. She spent the morning with her fair copy book, completing the survey record, and he worked at his bench repairing trap mechanisms. And they talked intermittently in the comfortable way of people who have discovered they have much to say to each other and are not in a hurry. He learned that she had been living in Denver, that she had a small office there that she rented by the month, that she took contracts wherever the work was because no single firm would employ her directly, that she had been doing this for 7 years and had completed surveys in Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico as well as Colorado. He learned that she had a younger brother in St. Louis who sold farm equipment and who she wrote to monthly and saw twice a year, and that she had a fundamental solitude to her life that was not unhappy but was, she admitted, sometimes more complete than she might have chosen if choosing had been available. He found himself, over the course of that storm-held morning, telling her things he had not told anyone. Not everything, not the darkest things, but the honest things. Why he had left Laramie, what he had been running from, which was not so much a specific thing as a general accumulation of a life that had not fit his actual shape. He had been engaged briefly to a woman in Laramie, a good woman, and it had not worked because he was not able to be the kind of man she needed, a settled man, a town man, a man whose world was bounded by fences and streets. He had felt terrible about ending it and had carried that guilt into the mountains with him, and 4 years of honest living had gradually converted it into something more like understanding of himself, of her, of the incompatibility that was no one's fault. "I think the mountains suited you," Violet said. "They did," he said. "They do." He looked at her. "Though I've been thinking lately that suited isn't quite the same as satisfied." She held his gaze for a moment, and he saw something flicker in her face that was not quite what she showed the world, something warmer, less defended, before she returned to her field book with the care of a person redirecting. The rain stopped by early afternoon. They both heard it cease at the same moment, both looked up, both looked toward the window. "Another day to the ridge?" he asked. "Early start tomorrow," she said. "I want to establish the northern control point while the light is good." "I'll take you up by the western approach," he said. "Longer walk, but the footing is better after rain." She nodded. "I'd like that." The afternoon was given to preparation. She organizing her instruments and field notes, he preparing the pack, checking the weather almanac, looking at the sky with the experienced eye of someone who had learned to read atmospheric conditions, the way a doctor reads a patient's face. The front had passed through cleanly. The next 2 days looked good. After that, the serious winter weather would begin to establish itself. He made dinner again, and she did not offer to help this time, not because she was passive but because he clearly wanted to do it and she recognized the gift in that. She sat by the fire with her notebook instead, checking her calculations, and he watched her from the kitchen corner and thought about boot prints on a trail and how strange it was that 2 days ago he had crouched over those small marks in the mud and felt something run up the back of his neck. And now she was here, and the trail had led, as it had perhaps known it would, to this. After dinner she said, "You mentioned you did some tracking work for the sheriff. Does that include Mercer Vane's kind of work?" He set down his coffee cup. "You mean, do I know what his next move looks like?" "Yes." He thought about it honestly. "He'll try to delay the survey filing. Paperwork, challenges to your credentials, appeals to the GLO district office. That can take months, maybe longer. In the meantime, he moves on the land quietly, starts improvements, claims squatters' rights, puts his men on it and makes it complicated." She nodded. She had thought about this. "If I file the survey notes with the Cree district recorder before I submit to the GLO, does that establish priority of record?" He looked at her. "It establishes that the survey data existed as of the filing date, yes. That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's quite a lot, actually." She was already writing something in her notebook. He watched her and felt that warmth move through him again, that deep and unfamiliar thing that had no name yet but was becoming less nameless every hour. He was not a man who moved quickly in any direction. He had made his peace with slowness as a virtue, with patience as a form of respect for the truth of things. But he was beginning to understand that something was happening to him that was not going to be managed by patience alone. The next morning they were on the trail before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks, moving through the sharp, brilliant aftermath of the storm in a world that had been washed clean and redetailed. Every rock and tree and ridge line in heightened focus against a sky that was the exact blue of pure cold. She walked beside him on the wider trail sections and ahead of him on the narrow ones, and he watched the way she moved through mountain terrain and found it beautiful in a way that was also somewhat alarming, because it was not separate from his regard for her mind and her skill and her honesty. It was part of a single whole. Everything about her was continuous with everything else. The western approach to the North Ridge was indeed longer, but the footing was reliable and the views were extraordinary, and she stopped twice to make notes in the field book about terrain features she had not been able to confirm from the basin floor, and each time she stopped he stopped with her and looked at what she was looking at, and she explained what she was noting and why. And he learned things about the science of land measurement that day that he had not known he wanted to know, until they were being told to him by someone for whom they were as natural as breathing. The northern control point was a granite outcrop at the ridge crest, and establishing it required an hour of careful instrument work in the cold, thin air at elevation. He held the range pole and read back the numbers and watched her turn the instrument with a focus so complete that the wind could have doubled and she would not have noticed. And when she had the readings she needed, she straightened up from the eyepiece and said, quietly to herself and possibly to the mountains, and possibly to the air that had been her father's last element too, "There it is." He said nothing. The moment was complete without his words. They were heading back down the ridge when they found the horse. It was tied to a spruce at the edge of a flat bench below the ridge crest, hidden from the main trail by a stand of young aspen but visible from the route they were taking. A big gray horse, good quality, and tied there deliberately, not a wandered animal. The knot was intentional, the location was too deliberate for accident. They both stopped. Daniel put his hand up and she stopped immediately and held very still. He scanned the bench, the tree line, the rocks. His hand moved to the rifle slung on his back. "Two men," she said quietly. "The rock formation to the left, shadow movement." He looked. She was right. 2 men, maybe more, positioned behind the rocks 40 yards away, positioned to see the trail. He had almost missed it. He looked at her with a new edge of alarm. "How did you see that?" "I triangulate habitually," she said, still quietly. "I was calculating the position of that bench relative to the ridge line, and I looked at the rocks as reference points. The shadows are wrong for this time of day." He had been tracking humans and animals in mountain terrain for the better part of 8 years. He had almost missed it. She had caught it while calculating terrain positions. He filed that away. He would think about that later when they were safe. Right now he was thinking about how to get them off this ridge without walking into a trap. "We go back up," he said. "There's a secondary descent on the east side of the ridge. It adds an hour, but it puts us below the tree line before we're in range of that bench." She nodded once. No argument, no questions, no drama. She turned and started back up the ridge at exactly the pace he set. They came off the ridge by the eastern descent and moved through the dense lower spruce at a pace that burned in the legs and lungs. And Daniel kept checking the back trail, watching for movement, reading the sound texture of the forest for anything that did not belong. They were a mile below the ridge before he slowed, and another mile below that before he was satisfied they had not been followed. He stopped behind a large boulder and she stopped with him, and they both breathed for a moment. "Vane's men," she said. It was not a question. "Most likely," he said. "They were watching the ridge trail, probably knew you'd need to work the North Ridge today. They've been watching your movements since before I arrived at your cabin," she said. "That's what I was trying to lose when I took the drainage route. I thought I had." "You did," he said. "They didn't follow you. They went ahead. They knew where you were going because they knew the survey area." She was quiet for a moment. "That's more organized than I expected from Vane." "He's hired serious help," Daniel said. "That's not a couple of cowhands. The way they were positioned, that was deliberate concealment. Someone trained them." He watched her think about this. She was not frightened, or if she was, the fear was integrated into the calculation rather than overwhelming it. She was angry in the specific, focused way of a person whose legitimate work is being threatened by a dishonest force, and that anger was clean and purposeful. "I have everything I need," she said. "The basin data, the control points, the North Ridge benchmark. I can complete the final calculations at the cabin tonight and write the formal survey description from those numbers. It's enough." "It's more than enough," he said, "and you know it." She met his eyes, and there was something in that meeting that was different from before, something stripped of the careful distance that both of them had been maintaining, something that acknowledged what had been building between them for 2 days without yet naming it. "We need to get the survey filed," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll ride into Creed with you." She started to say she did not need him to, and then she stopped herself, and he saw her stop herself, and it was oddly moving to watch. "Thank you," she said instead. They made the cabin in good time, and she went straight to the table and her field notes, and he went to the paddock and checked the horses and the fence line and the approaches to the cabin. And then he came inside and made coffee and left a cup at her elbow, and she reached for it without looking up. And the domesticity of that small moment hit him somewhere unguarded and stayed there, warm and entirely new. She worked for 3 hours on the final calculations. He sat across the table from her and read one of his books, and occasionally he looked up and she was entirely absorbed, her pen moving, her lips sometimes moving slightly with the numbers, and once she made a small sharp sound of satisfaction when a calculation resolved cleanly, and he felt a smile move across his face that he did not try to suppress. At some point she looked up and caught the tail end of that smile, and she said, "What?" "You made a sound," he said, "when the number came out right." She looked slightly embarrassed, which was so unexpected on her that he felt the smile deepen. "I do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been watching." She held his gaze. The fire was warm and the night was outside, and the survey notes were done, and they were both aware, with the particular awareness of two people who have been alone for a long time and have suddenly found someone who makes the solitude feel like deprivation, that something significant was happening. "Daniel," she said. "Yes. When I leave tomorrow, when I file the survey and go back to Denver," she stopped. She was not often at a loss for words, and the hesitation told him more than the words would have. "Come back," he said. She looked at him. "File the survey," he said. "Go back to Denver, do what you need to do, and come back." "Why?" she said, and it was not a challenge. It was an honest question from a woman who had learned to ask for the real reason, the actual reason, the reason that would hold up under scrutiny. He set down his book. He looked at her across the table with the directness that was his natural mode and said, "Because I found your boot print on my trail 2 days ago, and I have not stopped thinking about it since. Because you are the most capable and the most honest person I have been in the same room with in 4 years. Because when you made that sound over the calculation, just now, I felt it like a physical thing. And because this cabin has been just a place to live for a long time, and right now it feels like more than that. And I want to find out whether that's true or whether I'm a lonely fool reading what I want into something ordinary." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the fire, and the rain starting again at the windows, and the breath between them, and the possibility that lived in the space between a careful woman and an honest man. "You're not a fool," she said at last. "And it isn't ordinary." He reached across the table, and she put her hand on the table, and he covered it with his. And that was everything for that night, that contact, that acknowledgement, because both of them were people who moved through significant things carefully, and neither of them wanted to rush past the moment by rushing toward the next one. But she did not take her hand away, and he did not either, and they sat by the fire for another hour talking in the low, particular tones of people who are beginning to say things they have not said before, and the rain on the roof was not a hardship but a shelter. In the morning the sky was clear and cold and sharp-edged, the kind of Colorado autumn morning that feels like a gift. They rode together down the mountain toward Creed, she on the horse she had originally ridden up from town and he on the roan, and the trail was wide enough in most stretches to ride side by side, and they did. She had her survey kit in the saddle bags and her fair copy book wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, and in the leather satchel behind her saddle She had the formal survey description she had written out the night before in the precise, spare language of the General Land Office, a document that contained numbers and bearings and monuments and chains and links, and which also contained, in its absolute honesty, the end of Mercer Vane's scheme. They rode into Creede at mid-morning, and she went directly to the district recorder's office, and he went with her. And when the recorder, a small, dry man named Puddicombe, who had a way of looking at documents longer than he needed to before commenting, had finished looking at her credentials and her fair copy book and her formal survey description, he stamped the registration with the date and signed it and said, "This is a clean piece of work." "Thank you," Violet said. She would send the duplicates to the General Land Office regional office in Denver herself, by registered mail, within the week. The survey would be in the permanent record. The Hollowell boundary would be where the mathematics put it, which was not where Mercer Vane needed it to be, and there was nothing Vane could do about it now that was faster than legal challenge, and legal challenge moved slowly through Colorado courts, and the record was established. On the street outside the recorder's office, she stood in the morning sun and took a long, even breath, and Daniel watched her let go of the tension she had been carrying for the last week, watched it leave her shoulders and her jaw, and she turned to him with a look that was clear and free and entirely present. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. They had lunch in Creede's one decent restaurant, a proper meal at a proper table with coffee and bread, and a beef dish that was not remarkable but was hot and real, and they sat across from each other in the ordinary daylight of a public room and talked, and more than once the proprietress and the other patrons looked at them, because there was something between them that was visible, not improper, nothing like that. Just the quality of two people in the early stages of understanding each other and finding the understanding extraordinary. She had to send a telegram to the subcontracting firm in Denver confirming survey completion. He went with her to the telegraph office. On the way back, they passed the general store and she stopped to purchase supplies, and he stood outside while she was inside and thought about the next few months, the winter closing in, the mountain, the long, quiet solitude of it, and then, somewhere in the spring, a rider coming up the trail. He held that thought carefully, the way you hold something fragile, not squeezing it, just feeling the weight of it. She came out of the general store with a wrapped parcel of supplies and found him there, and she looked at him in the way she had developed of looking at him directly, without evasion, seeing what was actually there, and she said, "You're thinking about the spring." He smiled. "Yes, so am I," she said. They rode back up the mountain together because there was no reason not to, because her horse was at his cabin and her road south to Creede and then on to Denver ran past it anyway, and because they were not done with each other's company and both knew it. The afternoon was golden and long, the aspens along the lower trail having gone full gold in the past week, and the light through the aspen leaves was the color of everything that was about to end and everything that was about to begin. At the cabin she unsaddled her horse, and he helped her without making it a gesture, just the practical work of a shared task. She checked her saddle bags and made sure nothing was missing and repacked the oilcloth-wrapped field notes. "I'll leave early tomorrow," she said. "Before first light probably. I want to be through the lower canyon before midday." "I know," he said. "I'll write," she said. "When I'm in Denver." "I'll be here," he said. She stood by her horse in the last of the afternoon light, one hand on the saddle flap, and looked at him with that full and undisguised look she had for him now, the one without the careful distance. "Daniel," she said. He came to her. He did not hurry and he did not hesitate. He came to her and took her face in his hands with the same deliberate, unhurried care he gave to everything he valued, and she reached up and gripped the front of his coat, and he kissed her with his whole heart in it, in the way of a man who had been careful his whole life and was done being careful about this particular thing. She kissed him back with equal intent, with the absolute precision she brought to everything, and when they separated they were both quiet for a moment with the weight of what they had just made real. "Spring," she said. "Spring," he said. She left before first light, as she had said, and he heard her go, the soft sounds of her saddling her horse, the careful step on the porch boards, the creak of the gate, the measured sound of hoofbeats moving away down the trail in the dark. He lay in his bunk and listened until the sound was completely gone, and the mountain was only itself again. And then he lay there in the dark for a while longer and thought about how the specific silence of a person's absence was something entirely different from the general silence of solitude. He rose, built up the fire, made coffee, and stood at the window with his cup and watched the dark begin to separate into the first pale distinction of dawn. And he felt, in the complicated region of his chest, something that was partly loss and partly something he had not felt in a very long time. Something that looked, from this angle, very much like hope. The winter came in earnest the following week, and sealed the mountains in the way that Colorado mountain winters do completely, without negotiation, with enormous beauty and enormous severity in equal measure. Daniel worked his trap line and his territory, and he maintained the cabin and the animals, and he read his books, and he checked the mountains around him with the continuous, instinctive awareness of a man who had lived with them long enough to know their moods. And Violet Talmadge wrote to him. The first letter came 3 weeks after she had left, by way of the Creed Post rider who made the mail run up the mountain road once a month. It was written in her hand, which was precise and clear and moderately beautiful, the hand of someone who had done a great deal of careful writing, and it was 4 pages long. She told him about Denver, about the subcontracting firm's response to the completed survey, which had been favorable, and about the General Land Office's receipt of the filed documentation, which had been acknowledged by return correspondence. She told him about Mercer Vane, who had retained a lawyer in Pueblo and filed a formal challenge to her credentials with the GLO district office, which she had anticipated, and for which she had already prepared a comprehensive response. She told him about the response to the credential challenge, 3 letters of professional commendation, 2 from former survey commissioners, and 1 from a former Colorado territorial governor who had worked with her late father. The credential challenge had been dismissed. She told him about the city in winter, which she described with an affectionate impatience. She was a person of the open country, and the city's confinements were a tax she paid for the professional infrastructure it provided. She told him about a social function she had attended with a professional colleague, a woman who ran a millinery shop but who had a sharper mind for property law than most lawyers, and they had had a long and satisfying conversation about the mechanics of GLO survey procedure that had made the evening worthwhile. She told him in the last paragraph that she thought about the mountain and the work and the Northern Ridge benchmark and the cabin fire and his face in the firelight, and that she was not a person who said things she did not mean, and she meant that. He read the letter 4 times. He sat at the table where she had done her calculations and read it 4 times, and the cabin was full of her absence, and the letter made it both better and worse in the particular way that genuine correspondence does. He wrote back. He was not a natural writer. He was a man of action and observation rather than articulation, and writing cost him something that talking did not, but he wrote back a full 3 pages, which for him was considerable. He told her about the winter coming in, the first serious snowfall that had buried the high basin in 4 feet and made the elk come down to the lower meadows earlier than usual. He told her about the cave system he had been exploring along the eastern ridge, more extensive than he had mapped, a full quarter-mile of passage that opened into a chamber large enough to stable horses, which he had discovered only because he followed a bear's tracks into a section he had not previously entered. He told her about the almanac's prediction for the winter and his own assessment of why the almanac was wrong. He told her about the roan gelding, who had developed a strong opinion about which direction he wanted to go on the morning trail inspection, and who was entirely wrong but very committed. He told her that he had eaten dinner the previous night and looked across the table at the empty chair and the empty second coffee cup, and had understood with total clarity the distinction between suited and satisfied. He did not consider himself to be a man who said sentimental things, but those words were true, and he said them. The winter passed in letters. One from her, one from him, one from her, one from him, the rhythm of it sustaining and real, the letters growing longer and fuller as the months moved, as they learned each other by words the way they had begun to learn each other in person. She told him about the credential challenge finally being formally dismissed, and about the survey firm offering her a contract position. Not the full employed position that was still apparently a frontier too far, but a formal contracted relationship with guaranteed work and a designated office space, which was more than she had had before, and which she accepted on her own terms, with provisions she negotiated that gave her the autonomy she required. She told him about the Hollowell heir's letter of gratitude, which had come with a small financial recognition and a request that she document the full survey of their eastern sections in the spring, which would bring her back to the high country of Creed. Back to the high country of Creed. He read that twice as well. The winter passed. February became March and March became April, and the mountain began its slow, forceful return to life, the snowline retreating day by day up the slopes, the lower meadows greening, the elk moving back toward the higher elevations, and Daniel Bancroft found himself watching the southern trail with an attention that was not entirely professional. Her last letter before she left Denver had said, "Second week of April, weather permitting." The second week of April arrived. He had the cabin in the best order it had ever been in, not because he was performing domesticity for an audience, but because the standard he was holding himself to had risen, which was its own kind of information about his state of mind. He had cleared the brush from the front approach, repaired the porch boards that had been complaining since January, put a new shelf up in the main room. He had also, on one occasion, stood in the center of the main room and looked at it from the perspective of a woman who kept a careful, ordered field kit and thought about what she would see, and then spent the rest of the afternoon making various improvements. He had laughed at himself after, but he had not undone the improvements. On a Tuesday in the second week of April, in the late morning, he heard a horse on the southern trail. He was at the woodpile, and he stopped splitting wood and looked toward the trail head, and then he set the axe down and walked to the yard gate. She came through the trees into the clearing, and the spring light was full and generous, and she sat her horse with the upright, purposeful ease he remembered, and she saw him at the gate, and something moved in her face that was worth the whole winter. She dismounted before she was fully to the gate and walked the rest of the way, and he met her inside the gate, and she stopped in front of him and looked at him with those violet-gray eyes that had been seeing him clearly from the first moment. "Your gate is properly latched," she said. He laughed a full, real laugh, the kind that had been in short supply for 4 years, and she was laughing too, and he pulled her into his arms and she let him, pressing her face against his chest and gripping the front of his coat exactly as she had in the autumn, and he held her with his whole self in it, the way he had kissed her in the autumn, without reservation. "You came back," he said. "I said I would," she said, which was entirely characteristic and entirely her, and he pressed his lips to her hair and thought that he was a man who had spent a great deal of his life following tracks, and that the trail from those small boot prints in the mud beside Copper Creek to this moment in the spring yard was the most important trail he had ever followed. She stayed. Not permanently, not immediately. She had the Hollowell Eastern Section survey to complete, which would take 3 weeks, and she had obligations in Denver to fulfill through the summer. But she stayed at the cabin as her base of operations, and they fell into a rhythm that was so natural and so comfortable that it seemed less like something being built and more like something being recognized. She surveyed in the days, and they ate together in the evenings and talked long into the nights, and the cabin that had been just a place to live was decisively something else now. In the evenings she sometimes worked with her instruments on the cabin table, refining her calculations, writing up survey reports, and he watched her and read, and the shared silence between them was the most companionable thing he had ever known. He told her about the cave system in detail. She was immediately interested, both for personal curiosity and because the cave system had survey implications for the section lines of the Eastern Ridge, which was a legal area of active interest. They explored the cave together on a Sunday when she had no survey work scheduled. She with her instruments and her field book, and he with the good oil lanterns and the rope. And she mapped the cave passages with systematic efficiency, while he secured the route and managed the lighting. And when they emerged from the cave in the late afternoon, she was lit up with the satisfaction of having turned unknown space into known space. And he found her so genuinely beautiful in that specific joy that he said so. And she looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but was deeply moved. "You see me," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "Properly," she said. "All of it. Not despite the instruments and the numbers and the work, because of them. You are your work," he said. "Your work is you. There isn't a line between them." She was quiet for a moment in the afternoon light, holding her field book against her chest, and then she said, "Most men want me to set it down." "I know," he said. "Don't." She kissed him then, not his initiative but hers, standing on the rocky hillside outside the cave in the April sunlight. And it was the kiss of a woman who had been waiting a long time to be seen clearly, and was responding to it with her whole self. The weeks of the spring survey passed, and she filed the Hollowell Eastern section with the Creed recorder, and mailed the duplicates to the GLO, and received a letter from the subcontracting firm in Denver expressing satisfaction with her work, and formally requesting her contracted services for 2 additional surveys in the summer. She wrote back accepting both. She also wrote a long letter to her brother in St. Louis. He would learn from this letter about the mountain and the cabin and the man, and about the nature of what she was understanding about her own life and what she might want from it going forward. She did not frame it as a declaration or a decision. She framed it as an honest account, which was the only way she knew how to speak. Her brother, whose name was Thomas, a good-natured and perceptive man who knew his sister very well, wrote back within 2 weeks with a letter that expressed genuine happiness and a considerable amount of fraternal satisfaction, because Thomas Talmadge had been worrying about his sister's solitude for several years and had been told firmly and repeatedly that she was fine. She was, he gathered from her letter, better than fine. She left for Denver in late May to complete her contracted obligations there, and Daniel went with her as far as Creed, and at the stage depot he held her hands and looked at her, and she looked at him. "I've been thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The survey work I've contracted doesn't require me to be in Denver full-time," she said. "Particularly not after the summer. The GLO is moving toward district-based contracting, which means more work in the field and less work in city offices. A base of operations in the mountains would be entirely practical." He looked at her steadily, feeling the deliberate, careful shape of what she was saying. "Is that what you want?" "I'm asking whether it's what you want," she said, "before I want it." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his chest, against the place where the warmth had been living all winter, and he said, "It is what I want, very much, for as long as you want it." She searched his face with that surveyor's precision of hers, confirming the accuracy of the reading, and then she nodded once, the decisive nod of a woman making a decision based on verified data. "Then I'll be back in September," she said. "With more books," he smiled. "I'll put up another shelf." She kissed him goodbye at the stage depot with a directness that made the station agent look elsewhere, and then she was on the stage and gone south through the dust, and he rode the roan back up the mountain in the warm May morning with the particular lightness of a man who has been given something to wait for. The summer was long and busy and good. He contracted his tracking skills to the county sheriff's office for 3 jobs, a missing cattle situation in July that turned out to be an error in accounting rather than theft, a boundary dispute in August that required someone to read the old survey marks accurately, and a September tracking job that located a lost prospector 2 days into a blizzard on a route above Wagon Wheel Gap. All 3 jobs paid fairly. He used part of the money to add a proper lean-to extension to the south side of the cabin, which would serve as a workspace with the north-facing light that was ideal for detailed close work like map drawing and survey calculation. He also put up 3 new shelves. In late September, exactly as she had said, Violet came back up the mountain trail with her horse and her surveying kit and a significant number of books wrapped carefully in burlap. And when she came into the clearing and saw the lean-to extension and the light falling through its north-facing window, she stopped and stood very still. He was standing on the porch. He watched her look at the lean-to. "You built that for the light," she said. "North-facing is best for detailed work," he said. "Consistent illumination. Less shadows shift through the day." She looked at him across the yard with an expression so open and unguarded that it did something permanent to him, and she said, "Daniel Bancroft, that is the single most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me." He came down off the porch and she came across the yard, and they met in the middle of it the way they had been meeting since the beginning, directly, honestly, without ceremony or performance, 2 people who had found each other accurately. She moved into the cabin that autumn with the same practical efficiency she brought to survey setup, organized, decisive, without excess sentiment but with clear evidence of care in where things were placed and how. Her instruments had a station in the lean-to. Her books went on the new shelves and overflowed onto the old ones, and he adjusted the arrangement without complaint, because having the books mixed together seemed entirely right. Her field clothes and working gear integrated with his in the storage space off the main room in a way that was immediately logical and immediately domestically intimate and entirely comfortable. On a November evening, the anniversary month of the night she had first appeared at his door soaking wet and telling him about his horse, they sat by the fire after dinner and she was writing in her field book, and he was cleaning his rifle, and the cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the cold air that crept under the door, and she said, without looking up, "I want to marry you." He set the rifle down and looked at her. She looked up from the field book and met his eyes, and her expression was composed and direct and entirely sure. "I've been thinking about it carefully," she said. "I know what I want, and I know why I want it, and I am not inclined to be indirect about things that matter." He looked at her for a long, full moment, at the woman who had walked out of the rain and into his life with the first practical words she had ever said to him still hanging in the air between them, at the woman who had mapped a cave and triangulated the justice of 7,000 acres and made sounds of pure satisfaction when the numbers came out right, at the woman who had let him see her clearly and who saw him with the same clear-eyed accuracy, and he said, "Yes, yes, you'll marry me." She said with a slight precision that was entirely her. "Yes, I'll marry you," he said. "I would have asked you myself, but I knew you'd want to be the one to establish the control points." She laughed, really laughed, the full, unguarded laugh he had been collecting like specimens all year, and then she was across the room and in his arms and he was holding her and they were both laughing. And the fire was warm and the mountains were outside and dark and enormous and patient, as they had been before either of them existed and would be long after. But right now they were the backdrop, they were the setting, and the story happening in front of them was the story that mattered. They were married in Creed in December of 1882, in the small Methodist church that had been serving the mining community and the surrounding ranches since 1879. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Alcott, a practical man who conducted services with efficiency and genuine feeling in equal proportion. Violet's brother Thomas came from St. Louis, having traveled 3 days by train and another day by stage, and he sat in the front pew and looked at his sister standing beside Daniel Bancroft with the expression of a man whose worry has been permanently resolved. The recorder, Mr. Puddicombe, was also present, having been invited by Violet with a practicality that Daniel found entirely characteristic. Several of the ranchers from the surrounding country attended, as did the county sheriff, who had a high regard for Daniel's tracking work and an even higher regard for anyone who had successfully faced down Mercer vein, news of which had traveled the way news travels in frontier country, completely and with embellishment. Mercer Vane himself had, by December, departed Colorado for less surveyed territories, his legal challenge having failed, his scheme having been comprehensively documented in the official GLO record by a woman who knew exactly how documentation worked. He was not mourned. Violet wore a dark blue wool dress she had made in Denver, practical and warm for a mountain December, and she carried in her left hand a small bunch of dried wildflowers that Thomas had somehow managed to procure in Creede in December, which was a feat of brotherly determination that everyone acknowledged. Daniel wore his best clothes, which were clean and well-mended, and he stood at the altar with the solidity of a man who knew exactly where he was and had chosen to be there and was not going to be moved. When Reverend Alcott asked if he would take this woman as his wife, Daniel looked at Violet and said, "I do," in the same tone he used to state any fact he was completely certain of, which was the most genuinely romantic thing Violet had ever heard. She said "I do" with equal certainty. They rode back up the mountain that night, which was cold and clear and full of stars, the trail lit by a three-quarter moon that made the snow-covered peaks into something that seemed lit from within, and they rode side by side as they had been riding since the beginning, and the night was quiet around them, and the cabin waited above with the fire they had banked before leaving, and it was entirely and perfectly enough. The Linta was good through the winter. She worked at the table by the north window on the survey contracts that came by mail from the Denver firm, and on a series of precision map drawings she had been commissioned to produce for the GLO's district archive maps of the high basin country that were the most detailed and accurate representations of that terrain that had ever been produced, maps that would be referenced and used for decades. He came and went on his trap line and his contracted work, and returned to the cabin in the evenings to the smell of coffee and the sight of her at the work table, and the satisfaction of that was not something he ever entirely got used to, which seemed to him like the best possible thing. In the spring she told him there was going to be a baby. She told him in the same direct way she told him everything, looking up from the work table one morning with that clear, frank look and saying, "I've been calculating the evidence and the conclusion is fairly certain. We're going to have a child." He sat down. He was not, as a general rule, a man who sat down abruptly, but he sat down. He sat down on the chair by the fire and looked at her and felt the feeling that moved through him then as something without adequate language, too large for words, too fundamental, the feeling of a future becoming specific and real. "Are you all right?" she asked, watching him carefully. "Yes," he said, "more than all right." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I am well," she said. "I've been monitoring the situation and there's nothing concerning at this stage. I expect to work through most of the summer with appropriate modifications to the physical demands of survey field work." He laughed and it came from somewhere very deep. "Of course you do." She smiled, and it was the smile she kept for him, the private one, the one with all of its guard down. "Come here," she said. He came to her and crouched by her chair and took both her hands in his and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because they were both people who understood that some things were larger than language, and this was one of them. The summer was full and warm, and she worked the contracts with the modifications she had described, which were sensible and self-monitored, and which she managed with the same systematic competence she managed everything. She completed 2 field surveys, both in the lower country accessible without difficult altitude work, and she completed the GLO map commission and sent the finished drawings to Denver in a protective case she designed herself. She received a letter from the GLO district supervisor, a formal letter on official paper, commending the maps as exceptional work and formally requesting her continued collaboration on the district archive project. She showed Daniel the letter and he read it and looked at her and said, "I'm going to put this on the wall." "You are not," she said. He put it on the wall. She let it stay. Their son was born on a September morning in the cabin, delivered with the assistance of a midwife from Creed who had been engaged for the purpose, and who arrived 2 days before the birth, as Violet had planned, having sent for her well in advance. Daniel was present throughout. He was not, to his own surprise, afraid. He was intensely and completely present, doing whatever was asked of him with the same focused attention he brought to every significant thing. And when the midwife placed his son in his arms for the first time, he held the small, warm, astonishing weight of him and felt something shift in his understanding of the world so fundamentally that everything before it seemed like preparation. "He looks serious," Violet said from the bed, watching him. "He does," Daniel said. The baby was in fact looking at him with an expression of profound assessment that was entirely familiar. "He gets that from you," she said. "He gets it from his mother," Daniel said. They named him James, for Violet's father, whose name had been James Talmadge, and the name was given with the full, conscious weight of continuity, the surveyor's son naming his own son for the man who had first taught a girl to read the world's measurements on a high ridge in the San Juans. Thomas Talmadge came from St. Louis to meet his nephew in the autumn, making the journey with what was becoming characteristic reliability, and he sat in the cabin's main room with James in his arms and looked around at the books and the instruments and the lenta visible through the interior doorway, at the map-covered walls and the fire and the couple who moved around their shared space with the ease of people who had found their proper arrangement and settled into it. And he said to Daniel, privately, on the porch one evening, "You make her happy." Daniel looked at the mountains in the last of the evening light. "She makes me more than I was," he said. Thomas, who was a perceptive man, understood this was the truest and most complete thing that could be said. The autumn of 1883 was golden and long. Violet completed the final sections of the GLO archive maps, and they were formally accepted and entered into the permanent record, which meant they would be there in perpetuity. Her work on the public record of the territory she had measured, an achievement that she acknowledged privately with the same quality of satisfaction she expressed, when a good calculation resolved the small, internal sound of something being exactly right. She resumed field survey work in the spring of the following year when James was old enough for the rhythms of the work to accommodate him, and Daniel often came with her on the closer surveys, carrying the range pole as he had the first time, managing the logistics, understanding the work now with an informed respect that made him genuinely useful as a field partner. James, in the earliest months, traveled in the purpose-built carrier that his father had made from good leather and hickory to Violet's exact specifications, and later he toddled around the survey stations with the determined interest of a child who was being raised in the presence of two people who found almost everything fascinating. Mercer Vane remained gone from Colorado. The Hollowell heirs, the legitimate owners of the eastern section, expanded their operation onto the properly surveyed land, and were among the most prosperous and well-regarded ranching families in the Creed country. Their foreman stopped at the cabin one day in the summer of 1884 with a gift of smoked meat and a message from the Hollowell family expressing their continued gratitude, which Violet received with a direct and unsentimental acknowledgement that the work had been its own justification, and Daniel accepted the smoked meat on behalf of both of them without ceremony. The county, in 1884, offered Daniel a formal position as county surveyor's field agent, an actual position, with an actual salary, tied to the growing need for accurate land records as settlement expanded. He accepted, contingent on the understanding that he would also continue to take tracking and field assessment contracts at need. The county agreed. It was a good arrangement for a man whose skills were various and whose need for an indoor life was limited. Violet, who had watched the territory's need for survey work grow through 3 years of working in it, submitted a formal proposal to the GLO district office in 1885 for the establishment of a regional survey office in Creed, with herself as the district survey officer. It was, by any objective measure, the most qualified proposal the office had ever received. The first response was a procedural delay. The second response was a request for additional documentation of her credentials, which she supplied with the 3 letters of professional commendation and the formal acceptance of the GLO archive maps. The third response, in the winter of 1885, was an approval. The first formal regional survey office in the Creed district opened in the spring of 1886 in a 2-room building on the main street, and its first officer was Violet Bancroft, who had been Violet Talmadge, and whose name was in the permanent record of the General Land Office of the state of Colorado. Daniel rode into Creed the day the sign went up above the door, and he stood on the boardwalk across the street and looked at it. And Violet came out of the office and found him there and stood beside him, and they both looked at it together. The sign, the words, the public declaration of something that had been true and invisible for too long and was now simply true. She reached over and took his hand without looking away from the sign. He held it. They had a second child in 1887, a girl they named Clara, who was born with her mother's eyes and her father's thoroughgoing calm, and who slept her first night in the mountain cabin while her brother James, now 3 years old and already showing a strong interest in his mother's instruments, sat in his father's lap by the fire and was told by Daniel, in the quiet and specific way Daniel told things, about how the mountains were old and patient and would be there for all of it. And that was a good thing. The cabin expanded over the years, a new room added, then another. The Linta formalized into a proper survey studio with shelves Daniel built to Violet's specifications. The books continued to accumulate. The wall of maps was always changing, new surveys, new annotations, the evolving record of the territory that Violet was spending her life understanding with her instruments and her mind. On an October evening when James was 5 and Clara was 1, when the aspens were fully gold and the first snow had touched the high peaks, and Violet and Daniel sat on the porch in the last of the warm autumn light with the children inside and the mountains before them in all their ancient, uncomplicated permanence, he said, "Do you remember the boot print?" She looked at him sideways. "By Copper Creek." "You knew I'd followed it," he said. "I found where you stopped," she said, "the heel mark where you crouched. You have a particular way of standing when you're thinking. Your left foot comes forward." He looked at her. "How long have you known that?" "Since about the second day," she said. He laughed, and she smiled, and the light was the particular gold of Colorado October, and the mountains were patient around them. And it was the kind of moment that does not require description because it contains everything. The trail that had led here, from a boot print in the mud to a fire in the dark to a hand on a table to a word on a sign, the whole long, honest, accumulating story of 2 people who had found each other correctly and had not let go. He reached over and took her hand, as she had taken his on the boardwalk in Creed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the aspens turned in the evening wind, and the mountains held the last of the light, and the children were inside, and everything that had needed to be found had been found, and they were home, and they were together, and the trail behind them was a good one.